We're talking today about peace building in emergency contexts and really looking at UCP as a tool to try and advance sort of engaging in different environments earlier in the spectrum. I think that all of us would agree on this call that peace building is not linear and that we don't have to wait until conflict has ended to start engaging with peace building activities. However, in many of the policy spaces, peace building is treated as a linear approach, and it is something that comes after conflict. But the conditions that make peace possible, things like trust, inclusion, functional relationships, are most urgently needed during crisis, during conflict, and not after. And many times it's actually too late to try and address some of these underlying issues of trust and exclusion once the conflict has ended. So in this brief that Nonviolent Peaceforce brought out at the end of last year, we've really been looking at how unarmed civilian protection is not necessarily a precursor to peace building. It is peace building, and it is a peace building tool. It's peace building that's able to happen in crisis contexts because UCP is a tool that engages quite early on to try and address and redirect the trajectory of conflict. It really is a bridge between humanitarian safety and long-term peace-building contexts. The reason why we started looking at this was because, as we all know, the global context is quite dire. We've seen a massive surge in civilian deaths in armed conflict. We've seen an extreme number of people living in high or fragile contexts. And at the same time, we're seeing challenges in the funding context. We have 50% of ODA in extremely fragile settings as now humanitarian aid, while ODA for peace activities sits at its lowest level since 2004. So we're really spending more money responding to crisis than trying to prevent them. And when peace building is funded, I'm sure as we've all seen, it tends to sit in a separate lane from humanitarian and protection work. There are different donors, different timeframes, and different implementing partners. So the silos have become quite structural. Our argument in this paper is that it's not efficient and it's not effective, and it can actually be harmful in many cases to approach engagement in this manner. By the time stability arrives, trauma has deepened, divisions have hardened, and the window for prevention has often closed. So the core argument of this paper is really looking at UCP as an approach that combines immediate needs responses with longer-term strategy and engagement. It works with these three interlocking mechanisms: protective presence, relationship building, and inclusive engagement. UCP, or unarmed civilian protection, this approach doesn't wait for stability to begin. It works to try and contribute to stability. It doesn't rely on armed forces, but rather on trust, visibility, and community agency. So the central claim in the paper is really looking at UCP not just as a protection tool, but as peace building itself. It allows local actors to begin peace building activities in the midst of insecurity, rather than waiting for the situation to stabilize before social dynamics are addressed. UCP engages during unstable times using, as I had mentioned, protective presence and accompaniment, which is really looking at having a presence within the midst of violence to try and redirect the trajectory. Protective accompaniment, working with communities to try and understand where the risks are and how can community protection teams work to accompany actors to safe spaces. Looks at relationships building and inclusive engagement to both reduce threats and the impact of conflict on communities. In doing this, we are really aiming to center local agency to prevent violence and reduce threats in real time. Peacebuilding and unarmed civilian protection are not largely different in terms of many of the core principles of the approaches. Both are very focused on nonviolence, rejecting armed forces as a basis of safety. Local ownership is central to aspects. Communities lead, external actors support. Communities define what peace looks like and how to contribute towards peace. Conflict sensitivity and do no harm are core to all aspects of intervention. Trust building and relationships are foundational, not a byproduct, not an outcome, but really the core of all of the work. And inclusion is a central focus point, working with youth, women, marginalized groups at the center. What this approach really does is challenge this assumption that safety requires armed forces. It centers relational security instead. It's not a methodology per se, it's really just a fundamentally different way of approaching protection. And furthermore, UCP is not short-term or niche, which is really something that gets brought up quite a lot. We respond, yes, to immediate threats, but it also rebuilds social cohesion, reshapes norms around gender and leadership, and strengthens local institutions. The community protection groups that are set up are able to engage during the conflict and crisis moment, as well as remain active in post-conflict times. So the immediate and the structural work are happening simultaneously. There are 3 case studies, as Carlotta mentioned, that we reflect on, which are based on some of Nonviolent Peaceforce's work. And they look at 3 different spaces in which the sort of conflict cycle. We first look at Ukraine, which is an active conflict. We then look at the Philippines, which is more of a transitional post-conflict environment. And then at South Sudan, which is more of a latent, less sort of humanitarian emergency context right now. We had initially said not a crisis environment, but the context is escalating. So in Ukraine, and I'm just going to briefly touch on these examples. There's more in the brief, and there's also more that we can share in the question and answer section. But since the full-scale invasion in 2022, Ukraine has, faced mass displacement and destruction and a breakdown of community trust, amidst, especially in the areas of occupation and deoccupation. There's been a severe strain on social cohesion, particularly between the Russian-speaking population in the east and the Ukrainian-speaking population in the west. There's a lot of suspicion of collaboration with occupying forces. That's often based on misinformation or minimal evidence, and this is really deepening the rifts. So in this context, your traditional forms of peace building and the timelines around this could not wait until the context stabilized. There's a real need to address this underlying trauma, the social divisions, the lack of trust, in addition to providing the material aid and protection to communities. And so what Nonviolent Peaceforce has been working on in Ukraine is looking at setting up volunteer hubs in conflict-affected areas to illustrate how UCP mechanisms can create a breathing space of sort for peace building to take place, as well as meet protection needs, and all of this happening in the midst of active conflict. So as I had mentioned, NP worked with civil society actors to begin establishing volunteer hubs in cities around the country. Originally, these hubs were seen as logistical spaces, but they really evolved into neutral safe zones that provided a safe space for trauma support, for psychosocial care, for community dialogues, as well as a space where you would have access to protective accompaniment, as well as equipment if it was needed. There was psychological first aid trainings provided, stipends for frontline volunteers, equipment and protective gear from these spaces. And so in many ways, they were able to provide sort of a safe space where individuals could come and get access to what they needed, as well as starting to address some of the underlying tensions and challenges in the environment. It really sort of showed you that these spaces really address some of the very specific dynamics on the ground. They were really addressing the need of sort of the displaced communities that were facing discrimination, found a space for cross-cultural engagement. That some of the neighborhoods that had been blacklisted because there were suspected collaborators in that space, rather were sort of dismantled these narratives through inclusive dialogue and shifting the perceptions that people have. And then structured psychological sessions embedded in trauma-informed care were introduced within those spaces. So it really showed that sort of peace-building tools were being used, and peace-building was happening in the midst of the act of war, active conflict. And what began as immediate protection then evolved into more community-based peacebuilding infrastructure. So in our second case study in the Philippines, we really focus on now an environment that would be more of a sort of transition context or more of a post-conflict environment. And this really illustrates the use of some of the tools that are introduced under UCP can evolve into what's needed for the context at hand. And so very briefly in the Philippines, during the civilian-led ceasefire monitoring as a result of the conflict, there was an early warning, early response system set up. And so there were basically limitations realized in the ceasefire monitoring about only relying on a militarized armed approach, and that there's a need to really connect into a civilian component. And so built into the ceasefire monitoring process was a civilian protection component. And this was really embedded in community actors being engaged in ceasefire monitoring. And the ceasefire monitoring within this space really allowed them to monitor daily acts of violence or conflict in the environment, have an early warning system, early response system, and have some kind of protective accompaniment that was needed. But obviously, over time, the context and the situation evolved. And as that context evolved and there was a transition phase towards sort of more normalization in preparation for elections, this early warning, early response mechanism shifted to include more election-related violence monitoring. So drawing on the already established sort of community trusted relationships, the trusted presence, and the engagement with the community, this mechanism was able to track election-related violence incidences across the region, which ranged from armed clashes to more political intimidation or disinformation and displacement issues. And this information then fed into a multi-stakeholder platform that enabled joint risk analysis and rapid response by civil society and government agencies. So a mechanism that really began around ceasefire accountability transformed into an institutionalized civic mechanism for violent prevention and democratic participation. And this evolution was really possible because the mechanism was rooted within the community from the start. And so in this argument, we really see this core notion that community-rooted protection mechanisms are predisposed to endure and transform as things are needed across the phase of conflict. There's a lot more ownership and there's a lot more sustainability of these mechanisms. And this is what we saw with our engagement in the Philippines. Now, the last example I want to bring up is that of South Sudan. South Sudan is one of Nonviolent Peaceforce's longest standing programs, and we've been engaged there in different spaces for a long time. We would now say that this example is more an illustration of how some of these unarmed civilian protection tools can be used in more of a latent conflict environment, one in which there is a lot less attention from the international community. In this example, we're looking at age sets, and age sets are these structures that are set up within South Sudan where different peer groups are united along age lines, and one age bracket is seen as the protector of the group. Once there's a challenge from another age bracket, there'll be some kind of challenge, usually involving perhaps sticks or very minimal force, and a victor comes out, and that age set is now the protector of the community, and the other one draws into a different role. This has been a long-standing tradition within the Mole community, and one that's really rooted in a lot of how communities define and protect themselves. Over time, however, what we started to see was that the situation started to escalate. There was more access to weapons. So the age set challenges became more violent. There were more regular challenges. Instead of just a once a year occurrence, there were many and multiple different types of challenges throughout a year. And it was even escalating into challenges between communities instead of within one specific community within the region. And so this really triggered sort of a massive escalation in the conflict that was seen in the environment, and a kind of a distorting of the sort of cultural practices and the social roles within the community. So in response to this, Nonviolent Peaceforce worked with community members to set up these youth protection teams. And the youth protection teams were drawn from about 30 youth leaders from multiple age sets, from multiple different communities, and they were trained in nonviolence and early warning and in mediation and community safeties. These groups, which were initially seen as unlikely to work together, came together and built up a credibility and played a central role in identifying risk in the community, of mediating tensions, and supporting the establishment of a weapons-free zone. And this was really seen as quite significant, that we had groups of young people who are now advocating for traditionally giving up of weapons and for defining protection in an unarmed manner. So it was a direct sort of engagement in violence prevention, and it really became agents of social transformation. They facilitated dialogues across different generational divides, responded to early warning signals, and provided a lot of unarmed civilian accompaniment during moments of tension. There were also women protective teams that were engaged to try and build up awareness, and also to try and take on the issues of revenge killings or revenge attacks, and to protect vulnerable groups. So in essence, what we saw with this example is that these youth protection teams and these women protection teams, these community protection mechanisms, which are set up fundamentally as part of unarmed civilian protection during a time of tension, were able then to transform into more of a peace building model to try and address issues like social cohesion, like reconciliation, and model reconciliation, facilitating dialogue, and addressing some of the deep-rooted sort of identity challenges, as well as responding to any forms of tension and building up protection of vulnerable groups in the community. So we really saw a transformation in some ways of those that were perpetuating some of the violence into those that were leading the protection aspects. Now, I think most of us would be thinking, this all sounds great. And so why is it so difficult? Why is this not being scaled? What are the real challenges that we see in the policy space? And I think fundamentally, one of the biggest challenges is that something like unarmed civilian protection doesn't really sit squarely in the humanitarian or the peace building envelopes or the branches itself. We've seen that we still have a very siloed both funding and policy stream, where humanitarian and peacebuilding departments don't, and protection-based departments don't necessarily talk to one another. They do not necessarily plan together, and there's a persistent perception that a lot of UCP-based work is short-term, is more reactive, not seen as contributing to long-term notions of peacebuilding. And this really reiterates the fact that peacebuilding is seen as something that comes much later, after conflict, is long-term, and humanitarian engagement is much shorter term, much more reactive and less preventative in its approach. So this piecemeal approach really results in a lot of different actors engaging with different strategies. They engage with different communities, and there's not a lot of continuity at play. And this really creates a massive risk. And the distinction really, what we believe, is irrelevant, that at the field level, humanitarian protection and peacebuilding approaches are all integrated. Communities really focus on what works for them and what builds peace in their way. And so these artificial divides that we see in the policy and the funding space really need to be rethought in order to allow for more of an opening for different types of tools and approaches to be seen in crisis environments. We see a lot of opportunities in that there is some new thinking that really is focusing on communities and communities and local leadership, the nexus-based discussion, as well as this notion of investing in women, youth, and community approaches, which would address both immediate and long-term resilience. And there is an opportunity with sort of new thinking to come into this space. So we do see some opportunity to have these conversations and start trying to shift this narrative. And I want to pause at this point to pass it over to Anna to talk more specifically about what this means in the EU context, because this is where this conversation is situated right now.
Thanks, Lesley. So yeah, my name is Anna and I'm the representative of Nonviolent Peaceforce to the European Union based in Brussels. And as this call is co-hosted by EPLO and many of you in the audience work on EU affairs, we wanted just to connect some of those discussions to what is being discussed in Brussels right now. And obviously the first thing that comes to mind is this new EU approach to fragility, which will be a staff working document that will get published in the spring. Some points that are probably relevant to highlight here is that first, the structural problem really starts with the framing. As many of you probably know, this new EU approach to fragility will be an annex in a wider European Commission communication on humanitarian aid. And this in itself is quite symptomatic of the issue, because fragility is not just a humanitarian problem. And it's not something that can be solved just by humanitarian means. It's an HDP nexus problem. So starting this thinking and this policy framing from the humanitarian pillar risks reproducing exactly the linear sequential thinking that Lesley was talking about and that the evidence that we've gathered contradicts. So there is definitely a need to raise more awareness on this among EU policymakers in the run-up to the publication of the communication in this pretty soon in April or May. On the positive side, though, we can note that in 2024, there were council conclusions on protection in humanitarian settings that already opened the door to having those conversations on these interlinkages. Those council conclusions, they call on the EU, and I will quote, they call on the EU to pursue a reorientation of humanitarian action towards reducing protection risks. And they explicitly encouraged investment in activities that aim at preventing or interrupting the cycle of violence, including but not limited to humanitarian diplomacy, humanitarian mediation, early warning systems, protection by presence, the type of things that got mentioned in the example. So this is definitely something that is an opportunity, and there will be the 2-year anniversary of those council conclusions coming up in May. So maybe it will be one entry point to reinforce. And there are some member states like the Belgians who have put out a new humanitarian strategy that really makes this link on the reduction of violence, protecting civilians, and linking it to more transformational work. But what does this mean for funding, right? Because for those who are in Brussels, all of the discussions are on the next 7-year budget of the EU, the infamous multi-annual financial framework, the MFF. But because of all those interlinkages, Lesley was talking about the fact that we have those siloed funding envelopes. The big question is, how will the EU funding address the complexity and increase possibilities for including conflict sensitivity and peace-building elements in all of the different streams? But it will be particularly interesting to see how it fits into funding streams for humanitarian assistance, because they can complement and add value to humanitarian interventions. And finally, one last point from my side. One thing that I think still needs to be promoted as a concept in Brussels, particularly in the EU circles, is that it is possible to contribute to humanitarian protection and to peace-building objectives at the same time. And not necessarily in a multi-mandated way where you have departments of humanitarian affairs and department of peacebuilding doing their own work separately. but in a very integrated way. The examples Lesley gave show that it is possible to operate with the humanitarian principles while supporting community-led peace building. So yeah, I'll stop there and we can take it up in the Q&A a bit further. Thanks. And passing on, Lesley will close now.
Perfect. Thanks, Anna. I think I just had some last key messages that we wanted to end off with, which is almost exactly what Anna sort of reiterated, and that we really argue that peacebuilding can and must begin during crisis, that the root causes, issues such as exclusion, distrust, fractured institutions, these are most acute during crisis and not necessarily after. We can't wait until after to address a lot of this. That unarmed civilian protection is a tool that could be used as a way to try and nurture trust, reduce fear, create space for dialogue, inclusion, and transformation within crisis environments. It's not short term, it's not niche. Its impacts are structural, lay the foundation for broader social cohesion work and for other peace building engagements. And that, as Anna said, it is possible to undertake humanitarian and peacebuilding work in an integrated manner. It is really possible to look at peacebuilding based work that's rooted in community-led approaches and humanitarian principles. And so a lot of what we ask for in this paper is that we move beyond the siloed approach and we really start looking not just different departments, different organizations working side by side, but a true integrated approach to this work. And so to just end off, we thought that we would prompt a question to try and see if we can kickstart some of the discussion. And in this, we really say that we talk a lot about the Humanitarian-Development-Peace nexus as a framework, but in practice, we still organize a lot of funding, a lot of hiring, reporting, institutional identities around the silos it was supposed to dissolve. What would it really take to shift funding towards more iterative, non-linear models? Ones that fund protection and peace building as overlapping, simultaneous work rather than sequential steps. And perhaps you've seen some examples, good practices in your work that you could share, or ideas that you want to explore further.